Okay, guys, so of our three major eating disorder diagnoses, we have anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder. I'm not really going to talk much about that otherwise specified feeding and eating disorders because those aren't really as strongly associated with secondary exercise addiction and not as primary as these three. So I do want to talk about one more disorder in terms of DSM-5 criteria for diagnosis, and that is binge eating disorder. You should have some memory about binge eating disorder characteristics because I did spend some time talking about it, though not in full detail, in our lectures on food addiction. So again, just like for anorexia and bulimia, I have a brief. This one's only about 7-8 minutes long. It's a first-person account. A man by the name of Robert in the video who discusses his experience with binge eating disorder. And I think it will give you a really good window into what it's like for a person living with this disorder before I talk about the criteria for diagnosis. So if you would take a moment, that 8 minutes or so, to watch that video segment and then meet me back on this slide so we can talk about the DSM-5 criteria for binge eating disorder. So I'm going to keep going and assume you've come back after watching the video. So here we go. Again, some of this shouldn't be new to you because I did talk about some of this in our food addiction lectures. A, recurrent episodes of binge eating. Okay, so again, recurrent meaning this repeats itself over time. Binge eating is very similar to the binge portion of the binge purge cycle that I just talked about for bulimia. So recurrent episodes of binge eating, an episode of binge eating is characterized by both of the following. 1, eating in a discrete period of time, meaning a period of time that begins and ends. For example, within any 2-hour period. An amount of food that is definitely larger than most people would eat in a similar period of time under similar circumstances, right? So if most people within a 1 to 2 hour period would eat somewhere between, let's say, 500 and 1,000 calories, and someone else is eating 6,000 calories. That's an example of what we mean under similar circumstances. You're not being forced to eat it or anything like that under duress. Number 2, a sense of lack of control over eating during the episode. So this is very much the same as what people with bulimia nervosa experience during their binge portion of the binge purge cycle, that very frenzied, out of control eating where they feel they can't stop and they feel like they can't control how much they're taking in, okay? Now, part B of the criteria for binge eating disorder is that these recurrent, repeated episodes of binging, as described in Part A and defined in Part A, are associated with a minimum of 3 of 5 criteria. You have to have at least 3. Some people have 4. Some people have all 5. 1, eating much more quickly than normal, and that's part of that frenzied component. Eating until feeling uncomfortably full. The person keeps eating until the point where they feel like their stomach really hurts or like it's going to burst. It's so full. Number 3, eating large amounts of food when the person's not feeling particularly hungry. So you're not eating because of a hunger signal. Number 4, eating on your own, eating alone, because the person feels embarrassed by how much he or she is eating. They have an awareness that I can't do this in front of other people because they would look at me like something was wrong with me because I'm eating so much. And number 5, feeling a sense of disgust with yourself or depressed or very guilty afterwards. That is a very common experience of people with binge eating disorder, much like it is for people with bulimia during the binge cycle. This feeling of, I can't believe I did this. What's wrong with me? I'm disgusting. I have no control. And they get very depressed and feel very shameful about themselves. So that's part A. Part B here is part C. Marked distress regarding the binge eating. So this is that ego dystonic component. that much like people with bulimia, people with binge eating disorder have that ego-dystonic perspective. They are subjectively bothered, distressed by the fact that they can't stop these out of control eating episodes from recurring. And finally, D, let's see. D. That kind of looks like a D, doesn't it? D, the binge eating occurs on average at least once a week for 3 months. It can happen more frequently than that and often does. That's the minimum. And then E, the binge eating episodes are not associated with the recurrent use of inappropriate compensatory behavior such as purging, because clinicians are trying to differentiate binge eating disorder from bulimia. So one of the main differences is in binge eating disorder, the binge episodes happen with the excessive intake of high calorie, high sugar, high fat foods. And some of the similar psychological and cognitive pieces are there during binging. But unlike bulimia nervosa, people with binge eating disorder do not try to compensate by purging or getting rid of what they've taken in the way that I just discussed for bulimia. And another thing here is that the binge eating does not occur exclusively during the course of anorexia diagnoses, bulimia diagnoses, or avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So again, trying to differentiate binge eating disorder, which by the way was added in DSM-5. In DSM-4, I think I may have mentioned to you when we talked about food addiction, DSM-4 was considered something that required further study, but it wasn't an actual diagnosis yet. DSM-5 it is. So binge eating disorder is differentiated from the other eating disorders I've mentioned in the ways that I've discussed here. There's no purging. It's not part of an anorexia diagnosis where the person meets the other criteria for anorexia. It's not part of other eating disorders. It is its own category with this binging behavior as defined here as the primary set of criteria, the primary set of behaviors that define it. So I will meet you on the next slide. What I would like you to do before you move on to slide 9 is I would like you to think about these 3 main diagnoses to make sure you understand what makes them different from one another in terms of the behavioral patterns and in terms of the psychological components. What makes them similar to each other and what makes them different from one another, so you can really differentiate these 3 different types of eating disorders. And then meet me on the next slide because I want to talk a little bit about some of the common characteristics, psychologically speaking, of anorexia and bulimia, and then differentiate them from one another as well. Let's see if you come up with some of these. I didn't mention all of them yet. Some of them you wouldn't know, but some of them you might just from comparing and contrasting and from watching the videos too. The first person accounts I've asked you to watch, from watching those, see if you can discern some similarities and some differences between these 3 categories of eating disorder, and then meet me on slide 9. I'll catch you there.